Hello everyone, this is Chantal from glutenfreecooking123.com, and today I'm going to talk to you about sourdough starters, gluten-free sourdough starters. This right here is my gluten-free sourdough starter, and I have started it in the winter several months ago. That would have been maybe like, it has been around 8 months right now. 8 months right now, I think. Somewhere around there. I'm not sure how long it has been. But we did start it as a school project for my kids. I just wanted them to have this as their science project, and each of my kids had their own sourdough starter. My daughter had the wheat sourdough starter since she is not gluten-free, and my son had his project as a gluten-free sourdough starter, and we documented everything. And they had their own sheets, and they were writing all the information on each day, what was happening to the starter, what they were adding to it, and all that stuff. So we had everything documented, and the differences between the starters and how they were behaving. So I want to talk to you right now about my sourdough starter and how we worked on this. Actually, not just I, but my kids and I. And I have fed the starter just a few hours ago, and we have used it for 2 recipes so far. For the sourdough bread that you will be seeing a video about, a couple videos after this one, and sourdough pizza dough also. And these videos will be up after this video, so that you guys can see how to make these recipes as well. And they will also be on my blog. All these things will be on my blog, and I will put the link for this recipe down in the description box below as well. So let's talk about this sourdough starter. I have tried to make sourdough starters for many years, and they were always a fail. I was always interested in sourdough starters. I just didn't know why my sourdough starters were failing. They would either, like, my gluten-free sourdough starter would either not behave as a sourdough starter whatsoever. Like, it wouldn't start bubbling, it would go moldy, and it was just being terrible. My wheat sourdough starter was doing terrible as well. It would become a sourdough starter, but it was so weak that it wouldn't really do anything. And so as we were doing this experiment, we saw the difference between both. After I had all these experiences with trying to make my own sourdough starter, a gluten-free sourdough starter, I decided that I want to add honey to this one, because I was thinking this the yeasts in the sourdough starter, the wild yeast that the sourdough harvests from the air, they feed on simple sugars. And I thought, well, honey is a simple sugar, and I know a lot of people say don't add sugar and don't add honey, but I thought, I want to see what happens. And I also wanted to add things that would have a lot more sugars in them, like, and this is why I decided to add the brown rice flour and potato starch, because I was thinking potato has a lot of sugar in it, and also the brown rice has a lot of sugar in it as well. And this is why we decided to use these things, and we added the honey as well. So what we did is we started by adding 1/2 cup of brown rice flour and 1/4 cup of potato starch, and we also added the same amount of water to them, which is 1/2 cup of brown rice flour, which is 3/4 cups of water. Sorry, my brain is dying right now. I'm tired and I'm thirsty. Anyways, and we also added 2 teaspoons of honey. So what happened after adding this amount of water is that the starter was super liquidy. I'll be right back. Yeah, I know. So after adding this amount of water to it, we noticed that it was being super runny, and the carbon dioxide was having a hard time being trapped inside this runny mixture of sourdough starter. So we decided to reduce the amount of water, and we did. We reduced it by 1/4 cup, and at the beginning it felt like it was too thick. So we added 1/2 cup and 2 tablespoons of water to compensate for the thickness. So we wanted it more like a pancake batter instead of a thick batter, and instead of a runny batter also. So after we did that, we started noticing that it was behaving a lot better, and the bubbles were being able to be trapped a lot better in that sort of a batter. So my suggestion to you, that if you do want to have your own sourdough starter, try to make the batter a little bit on the thicker side. You don't want it to be runny, because the runnier the batter is, the harder for the bread to rise, and also it becomes harder to compensate, to adjust the liquid amount that you are going to be adding to your bread and to your breads and dough and all the things that you are going to be using the sourdough starter with. And as I was doing research on sourdough starters, I was looking at the wheat sourdough starters. I noticed that most professional bakers have their sourdough starters a lot on the thicker side, and their breads come out amazing. They also measure the sourdough amount that they put in their breads by gram, which would be a lot better, but right now I haven't measured my sourdough starter by grams in my recipe, and I'm working on doing that. I will try to do that in the future so that you guys know exactly the amount of sourdough starter that you are going to be using in your bread. And I would suggest you get a kitchen scale, because I noticed from my wheat sourdough starter, when I do make bread, if I measure it by cup, that the amount that I add to the bread varies in volume, but it does not vary in gram. So because the sourdough starter might be well risen, where it has a lot of bubbles in it, and sometimes when you're using it, it might not have a lot of bubbles in it. Like for example, if you're working with it during the winter, it's going to take a longer time to reach that stage where it is where the bubbles are super big and it has a lot of bubbles in it and it's frothy and it's overtaking your sourdough container. So that's why I want to have that in gram for you guys, so that you will have an accurate measurement for the bread, and so that it will always turn out the same. And for my wheat sourdough bread that I make, it just turns out amazing. I haven't tasted it, I don't know what it tastes like, but my husband and my daughter love it. They just devour it, and it has giant bubbles in it. And it turns out amazing. Anyways, so back to the gluten-free sourdough starter. So on the first day, like I said, you want to add a cup of half a cup of rice flour, and 1/4 cup brown rice flour, and 1/4 cup of potato starch, and 2 teaspoons of honey. And now if you live in a warm environment, you might not need to add the honey, and if you just want to forgo the honey for good, you can also forgo it even if you live in a cold environment, and see what happens and let me know. And also you are going to add water to it. Now I will say at the beginning you will need to add a little more water, so you're going to be adding half a cup and 2 tablespoons of water. You want to achieve a little bit thicker than pancake batter, and so just monitor the amount of water that you are adding and see how it works for you, because every sourdough starter is not going to be exactly the same, and the way how you see a pancake batter might be different than the way how I see it, what a pancake batter thickness is. And on the second day, you are going to discard half of the sourdough starter and add again half a cup of brown rice flour, 1/4 cup of potato starch, 2 teaspoons of honey, and a cup and 2 tablespoons, half a cup and 2 tablespoons of water. And you're going to keep discarding half each day, and you are going to keep repeating the same process every day for 5 days. On the 6th and 7th day, you want to feed the sourdough starter twice, and before you feed it again, you have to discard half of it. Discard half of it, feed it the first time, a half a cup of brown rice flour, a quarter cup of potato starch, and 2 teaspoons of honey, and half a cup of water and 2 tablespoons. So you do that in the morning, and then 12 hours later you also discard half of it and you feed it again the same amount. And so on the 7th day as well, you will do the same thing on the 7th day. So what else do I want to talk about? I'm just trying to gather my thoughts. It was hard for me to talk about the subject. I was thinking, how am I going to talk about this? It's kind of it's not a difficult subject. I just didn't know how to gather my thoughts around this one. I wanted to say also, I found that the best utensil to make the sourdough starter in it would be a glass jar of some sort. It doesn't have to be big unless you are adding the amounts that I'm talking about, because sometimes, especially if it's hot, the sourdough starter is going to rise really high. So that's why I'm using this big glass container over here. I also found that making sourdough starters from my previous failures, making them in plastic is not a good idea, because plastic holds on to stuff, and it was causing, my belief is that it was causing mold to appear in my sourdough starters, because you can't really sanitize plastic as well as you can sanitize glass, and sometimes it might have some cuts in it or whatever, and it will hold on to bacteria. So really the best container that you want to make your sourdough starter in would be a glass container, sorry. Also, if you do not want to discard the sourdough starter, what you can do is turn it into bread. You can just add a little bit of brown rice flour to it, and some salt and sugar, some olive oil, and you can make flat bread from it. You can also turn it into a pizza dough and bake it first, of course. You can bake it on a cast iron pan. Just make sure to preheat the cast iron pan beforehand, and spread it and bake it for however it takes for that dough to get baked, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, it depends how big it is. And you might also be able to use it in pancakes or however you want. So that is really how easy it is to make sourdough starter. You just have to be patient, and you have to document what you're doing just to make sure that you're not missing anything. And you also want to feed it, when you are starting it, you want to feed it at exactly as, not necessarily exactly, but at least at a similar time as you have fed it previously. You don't want it to starve, and you don't want it to be too full. So just make sure to try to feed it at least at the same time you fed it the day before, and don't forget to discard half of it before you feed it. I know it sounds, I mean, especially with gluten-free sourdough starters, it feels like such a waste to throw half of the sourdough starter away, and that's why I suggest just turn it into flatbread or whatever, because gluten-free flour is not cheap, it's expensive. So when the sourdough starter is young, which means when the sourdough starter is about 7 days old, and it might take longer for you to start to have it really go. It did take longer for us because we live in a colder environment, and we were making it in the winter, so it might take longer than 7 days. And if it does take longer than 7 days, try to continue feeding it twice a day until from the 6th day until it reaches the point where you start seeing those bubbles and smelling a hint of sourness in it. That's when you know that it is ready. Also, if you live in a really hot environment, you might start seeing bubbles really early, like maybe on the 3rd day. That does not mean that your sourdough starter is ready, because you need that yeast to multiply in the sourdough starter, and on the 3rd day you don't have enough yeast in there for your sourdough starter to be ready. you sure can put it in the fridge, but you can't use it for bread. And even on the 7th day, you really can't use it for bread. You have to raise it until it reaches a point where it does have a lot of yeast bacteria in it. So it can work on raising bread, because the process of raising bread, especially gluten-free, rising bread, especially gluten-free bread, is hard, because it is denser than the wheat bread. Especially because wheat bread is glutinous, and it can stretch and help the sourdough starter to create those bubbles and hold on to the bubbles inside the bread, while the gluten-free bread does not have that elasticity in it, so it's going to be harder for it to hold on to the bubbles. And that's why you want the sourdough starter to be really mature before you start using it for bread. And I can't think of anything else really to talk about. If you guys have any questions, just hit them down in the comments below, and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. I myself am still new at this whole sourdough starter thing, and I'm still learning about it, but I'm sharing with you what I have learned. And a really good source for sourdough starters would be Wardy. She has an amazing channel, and I have been following her for years, and she does a lot of natural cooking classes and fermentation and all that stuff. And if you guys are wondering what's that behind me on the counter, these are all ferments that I've been doing from our vegetable garden over here, and I've been loving it. They're just super healthy for us, and we just love fermented vegetables. So yeah, that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you like this video, hit the like button and share it with your friends and family. And if you are new to this channel, hit the subscribe button and the bell so that you can receive notifications of whenever I upload new videos. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next episode.